clicked the button. The big lady's voice yelled at me, said the recording's in progress. So let me go ahead and introduce Sicely. So Sicely Kluge is a LCSW, a licensed clinical social worker specializing in complex trauma at the SAU Survivor Recovery Center. Nationally certified in both EMDR and trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. She integrates EMDR, detachment regulation, and competency framework, and play therapy to support trauma recovery across the lifespan. In addition to her clinical work, Sicely serves on the advisory board for the University of Illinois Springfield's Human Development Counseling Program as an instructor at Family and Community Medicine at SAU School of Medicine, where I know her from. She contributes to systems level change as a work group member from the Massey Commission's Integrated Mental Health and Emergency Responses, there's a lot of words there, initiative, and has co-authored multiple projects with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Sicely is dedicated to advancing trauma-informed care through direct practice, teaching, and policy advocacy. Outside of her professional roles, Sicely is a firm believer in the healing power of relationships, laughter, and well-timed coffee. She finds grounding in time with family, long walks, and occasional overly ambitious DIY project. Thank you, Sicely.
Yes. Thank you all for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I am hearing myself echo, so I'm going to try my best not to pause too much, thinking someone else is talking. But if I have like an awkward pause, that's probably what it is. I heard myself echo. So first and foremost, though, thank you, Adam, for that introduction. But what I want you all to know is it genuinely makes my heart so happy that you all are already here and willing to learn and support your children through this process. As somebody who's worked with children for a really long time, the biggest thing that I see that makes a huge change in children's lives is when their parents are engaged and willing to be a part of that process. And something I always, highly recommend and really try to take a teamwork approach, just, supporting children. So the fact that you all are already here, it just makes my heart happy. So I'm very excited to kind of jump into this. What I kind of planned for today really was I have some handouts, and I was going to give a brief overview of trauma-informed care, but I find it most beneficial to have a lot of discussion and questions. And towards the end or throughout, I have a notepad here, and if there's any specific resource or topic you want resources on, to make it worthwhile of our time, I will write that down and send even more resources, book recommendations, podcasts, things like that. And send those to Adam, if you're okay with that, Adam, to kind of disseminate. Yeah, to kind of disseminate. There's just so much information that really when I spend my time with people, I want to know what you guys want to know and what questions you have and certain directions that you may want support with. And so the best way I can do that is give you guys resources on that to do some further reading or research or listening podcasts, whatever it is. But definitely for today, I wanted to get into the basics of trauma-informed care, the impact of trauma, of course, on our kiddos and especially our LGBTQ kiddos. And then kind of talk about what does that even look like in parenting and why it matters. Any questions so far?
Everybody looks pretty excited to hear what you have to say.
All right, great. Okay, so trauma-informed care really is about not treating the trauma directly, but really it's a mindset and approach to acknowledging the impact that trauma can have on an individual. And it focuses on creating environments that can feel healing, trusting, or empowering to that person after they've experienced something. We know, obviously, through not just anecdotal experiences or kids just talking about what they've been through, but we also know through the research that there are specific types of traumas that LGBTQ kiddos seem to face at much higher rates. That absolutely includes bullying, harassment, or hate crime related violences, rejection by family, peers, and or faith communities, potentially if that's a part of their life, discrimination in schools, healthcare settings, and public spaces, and a lot of internalized shame or fear of coming out. And that internalized shame and fear, sometimes people may think, well, what is that? Like, why is that identified as a trauma? And what I always remind people of is there are events that happen in our life, but how we carry it afterwards is what feels oftentimes traumatizing for people. It's the ongoing effect of that event. So something that maybe like a random example, right? Like I lived in Alaska and we were in a 7.2 earthquake. That does not cause ongoing effects for me. I don't have nightmares. I'm not scared of I wasn't scared of earthquakes afterwards, really. I think there was a desensitization process to aftershocks. If you've ever been in a big earthquake, there are aftershocks. So you kind of get used to it, desensitized to it. So for me, I would not necessarily call that a trauma for myself because it doesn't have a lasting impact. And so every person is different, and that's definitely important to remember. And so to really understand the full impact of trauma, there are two handouts that I gave. The first one, I think you all have some packets, is from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. This is specific to age-related reactions. The reason I gave this is because every kid, of course, is different, but there are unique things that will happen depending on age. So for example, a 5-year-old might be 5, 6, 7-year-old might be playing out their experiences through play. Whether it's with peers or even on their own, you may not see that in a teenager. You're probably not going to see them, playing with their stuffies in a certain way. So that is the first handout that I gave you, is about those age-related reactions and really having an understanding that there is a bit of a difference. And then the other one that can be really helpful to notice is another handout on the risks and protective factors. And that one's from the Department of Health and Human Services. Um, I'm a very visual person. I don't know if other people are visual, but this handout to me feels the most like tangible, and it gives great visual examples of not just risk factors or things to even notice with the individual, but then it adds on what are individual, family, and community level protective factors. Now, why do we talk about protective factors? We talk about that because it is what reduces the risk of long-term harm from the trauma that our kids may experience. And for our kiddos who identify as LGBTQ, those protective factors, I mean, it's very important for all kids, but those protective factors are especially important to really explore and figure out, oh, well, my family has these protective factors going pretty well. Maybe it can improve in this area. And we know that's important because of the heightened risks that some of our LGBTQ, not some, a lot of them have for different types of trauma or adversity. So with this second graphic, what you'll see is in the key, whoops, I'm pressing around here. There should be a little key on the right side. You'll see it coded with either a little red person or a green person. And the red is the risk factors, the green is the protective factors. If it has one person, of course, you can see in the key it's an individual, the risk or protective factor on that individual. If it's the little 3 people, that might be the family, or the multiple people is a school or community. And the risk factors are also color coded to what increases their risk for certain mental health conditions later in life as well. Um, so again, this is just a really nice visual of, okay, if this is going on with my kiddo or even my kiddo's friend or a family member or, whoever is the loved one in my life, then maybe these are things I can look at on the right side with the green individuals that can actually help improve their outcomes. Adam, am I able to share my screen?
Let me see. All participants should be able to.
Okay.
So yes.
I'm going to try to share my screen and see.
Fingers
Yeah.
crossed.
Okay. And so okay, can everyone see that image?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, great. And so this first image here, what this is it's explaining how the research shows that if we give children positive supports are never a bad thing. But the problem is if we block them from being able to cope with stressful experiences. Now, this isn't to say to add trauma to your kid's life. That's what I always tell people. Like, don't purposefully do that, right? But if we try to shield them from, say, for example, I work with kids all the way down to sometimes 3 years old. So, I may be working with a parent who, is very anxious about their kid getting hurt. And so maybe their kid's 4 years old and wants to climb a rock wall and they won't let them do that. What that can sometimes shield them from is actually learning how to cope with bad experiences of falling down and getting hurt. We don't obviously want anything major to happen to our kids, but what we found is when that happens, it actually creates less resilient adults later in life. Adults who aren't able to cope with day-to-day work stress or cope with conflict in with friends, um, have a much harder time being able to get through their day. The ideal, obviously, situation is a balanced approach and because we don't want really bad experiences for our kids overall. But what they did find is even if we do have kids who have experienced a lot of trauma throughout their life, if you can add multiple protective factors or positive supports, it actually creates more resilient adults later in life. And so I like to show this image. I'll go ahead and stop sharing here. I like to share this image because I oftentimes find parents or family members really beating themselves up about what their kids have been through. My kid's 5 and she's already been through things, unfortunately, like in daycare and things like that. But I remind myself of like, what's so hard is we can't control everything, right? But what we can control is those protective factors and those positive supports that we're giving kids. And I think that's even more important, especially knowing the state of our country and our world right now with our kiddos who identify as LGBTQ, right? I think there's so much fear, even more so than there was before. Um, and so, real quick, I want to go through this 6 principles, what those might look like, and what it might look like in everyday parenting. The first principle of trauma-informed care for parents is safety, physical and emotional safety, making home a place where your child feels secure to be themselves, using affirmative language, trying to avoid jokes or comments that can feel invalidating, even if it's not directed towards them. Sometimes I might, and I should also say it can be anything that could be perceived as like shameful or negative. Like I try to encourage avoiding even jokes about that. Some family members may be really careful around topics of LGBTQ, but then may turn around and I'm just going to use this quote in like quotations because you guys will get what I mean. But like they'll then go on to maybe like shame someone for their like obesity status, right? Or fat shame is what it's called, right? And so that when we can avoid those things, it creates an environment in which no matter what our kids are going through, they will be more willing to come forward and tell us things. For that emotional safety too, it's so easy for us to jump into problem solving, but what I really encourage is really just sitting down and listening to what they're saying, trying to name that emotion of that sounds so aggravating that a friend would do that, to you at school. I'm so sorry that happened. And just starting the conversation like that instead of, and I'm so guilty of it too, right? Like my kid will come home and say like some girl said something mean to her because she's 5 and they're starting to get a little, um, and I'll jump to like, well, what'd you say back? I'm like, well, how'd you stick up for yourself? That's jumping into problem solving. I try to avoid that. None of us are perfect at this though. But just a nice reminder. The second one is trust and transparency. Being honest and open, especially if you're also learning and growing in your own understanding. Um, Whether it comes to, a very common thing with parents that I hear is terminology around LGBTQ youth, and there's a lot of confusion. And just being honest about that, of like, I am here to support you, I love you, and I am learning, so let me know if I mess something up. That's just an honest and open answer. Being honest and open maybe about the state of the world or the state of our country right now. We should be buffering our stress from our kids, but it's also okay. This sounds a little bit contradictory, but it's also okay to say, like, when you're having these conversations of like, I get it. I feel very scared too. Um, but then the reminder of what you are doing to help be protective of your kiddos is very important for them to hear. But being honest in how you're feeling, I think, is very helpful. It also models how to talk about these hard things. And showing your child consistent and reliable support. Obviously, that consistency is what also creates the emotional safety. Peer support and connection is the third one. This obviously being able, I think it kind of speaks for itself, right? But connecting yourself, what you guys are already doing here, and connecting your kids to support groups or other peers, groups that are very affirming, that's incredibly important to building their resiliency, their strength, their protective factors. The fourth one is collaboration and mutuality. So finding ways to include your child in age appropriate decisions, like, if my kid's only 5, so I wouldn't do this right now, but maybe if my kid were 15, and this depends on your own comfort level. So I'm not saying anybody has to do this, but this is just an example. Maybe they're consistently fearful and talking about what's happening right now in our country. Well, one thing that's really hard is when we get stuck in that fear. And so I may offer some suggestions, like actionable plans, and help work with my child to find some things that we can do with that fear. So I may say, well, would you want to go on a walk? Do you want to write a letter to our representative? Do you want to advocate at your school for changes? Like giving them options so there can be actionable steps and supporting them through that so they don't feel stuck in that fear and they're not frozen. It gives them a sense of control, of course, when things feel out of control. And that's what's most important. Empowerment, voice and choice, kind of going back to mutuality, but giving choices very important as well. This is the fifth one, the empowerment and voice one. Respecting their choices, of course, of name, pronouns, clothing, and self-expression. It really just communicates the message of I see you, I'm here for you, I hear you, which is what kids need. And then also understanding cultural, historical, and obviously gender awarenesses, but you can expand that to, any type of, cultural piece. Um, but being able to also have open conversations about this, how it might impact their day-to-day life, making sure, again, going back to finding ways that they can put that into action, recognizing their own unique experiences, even within the LGBTQ community, everyone still has their own unique experience. Um, and understanding how historical trauma can also impact where they're at today as well. Even if it's not something they directly experience, there's also a collective fear, a collective anger, a collective grief that people are going through right now that impacts our kiddos. But what's important is being open and having those conversations with kiddos. So what this looks like in everyday parenting or everyday life, if you're not, in a parenting role, but it's a family member, this can apply to anybody. But of course, listening without judgment, apologizing and learning. So one of the biggest things that research also shows us is getting good at repair. How to repair when we've messed up as a parent is 10 times more, not literally 10 times, by the way. I'm just kind of throwing a number out there, but it is so much more important. We do know the research shows that than getting everything right as a parent. Because one, that's not realistic. We're not going to get everything right, but we absolutely can go back and say, I'm really sorry I messed up or I lost my cool there and I'm really working on that. You're not the one who's responsible for how I feel. And I'm sorry I yelled at you. You know, and that's not I'm sorry this happened, but you shouldn't have acted that way, right? It's taking true accountability and repairing that relationship and what happened. Being their advocate. Kids unfortunately have no control. I mean, we can give them choices and help them feel in control, but in this world with school, public places, healthcare, they really don't have much control. So once you are talking to them about what they want, advocating for them and being their voice too, it also models for them how to speak up for themselves. Watching for signs of trauma. This one's tough for me, the watching for signs, because it's different for every kid. A kiddo who may seem a bit more withdrawal, that may be their norm. They may be more introverted. So that might not be a sign for them versus if this were a kiddo who was very extroverted, wanted to be around friends, and then all of a sudden withdrew, that may be like, okay, what's going on here? So I do find it important to know what signs are like withdrawal socially, anxiety, self-harm, depression, but just remembering that it really depends on your kid and what feels different to you. Whether it's emotionally or behaviorally, things like that. And then, of course, celebrating your child's identity, rather than just tolerating it. It's not uncommon that I see families really just trying to, like like I said, tolerate it, get through their day, just be like, oh, okay, this is just a stage. Like that's not celebrating it. That's not hearing them for who they are and seeing them for who they are. So why all this matters, LGBTQ who feel supported by their families are significantly less likely to experience depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. Um, and again, like I mentioned, it's not about perfection, but it is about creating the relationships, the safety, the repair, so we can be there for our kids and our kids feel comfortable coming to us. We do know resiliency obviously mitigates those even longer term health outcomes. So there was a study done called the ACEs study. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with it. But it's a longitudinal study, a long time, that they had researched this of people who had experienced different types of traumas. And basically what they found was, the higher the number of trauma they had experienced in early childhood, the higher, their health outcomes were, and not just mental health, but also things like autoimmune disorders, COPD, diabetes, like there were tons of different health outcomes. And so when we can put these protective factors on, we know the research shows it significantly reduces that for our kids. So that's why it's very important to look at that. And remembering to always use your community. You don't have to have all the answers, but what really matters the most is that you're showing up, you're listening, you're open, and you're committed to learning, and you're constantly talking to our kiddos about that. So for the kind of the basic overview of what those protective factors can actually look like, I did give you the other well, the risk and protective factors, but then the other two handouts, one is knowing who can make a difference in your child's life. So that one's all about remembering that um, it's we can try try to build a community around our kids. So you guys again are already starting that right now in this group, but who else can we bring in? Are there mentorship programs? Are there different places we can get them connected to, like the YMCA or, wherever it might be, depending on, what your comfort level is and what you want for your family. Everybody's a little bit different. But knowing that community is so important for our kiddos. We have, I think, gotten to this place of living in a society that doesn't have as much community around parenting and raising kids. And so that's definitely an important thing to bring back, obviously within the realm of what you're comfortable with and, safety, of course. And then the last one was the stress busters. So that one just gives specific examples of what are some examples of supportive relationships, quality sleep, physical activity, things like that to look through. Um, and oh, I did have one more, sorry. The last handout I gave you was just for your own reading on a brief research article on resiliency and mental health among LGBTQ youth. And that piece really looks at, um, you know, kids who had higher protective factors, LGBTQ youth who had higher protective factors had significantly lower mental health concerns. So that's just, for some of your own reading there too. Okay, so I'm going to pause there though. And I know I gave you already a wealth of information. These trainings that I do for people, honestly, are usually anywhere between 3 and 4 hours long. So I tried my best to kind of collect some of the most important pieces, but I want to open it up to more discussion, thoughts, questions, and making sure I can gather some more resources to give you guys.
With older children, that maybe they're struggling with depression or stress or all of the above, I've sometimes struggled to get them to, depending on how depressed they are, did they struggle to actually open up and tell us what's wrong? Do you have any tips for, oh, sorry, your microphone's this way. Do you have any tips for how we can engage them in a way that they can finally open up and share what's going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, and so many people, I will say, struggle a lot with their older kiddos, whether that's a older teenager or young adult, because they're also naturally in this phase of independence. They don't want anything to do with parents, right? They want to kind of do their own thing. So one, very important to make sure that we aren't internalizing that of like what we did wrong. But the second piece to that is I kind of go back to the repair piece. And it's not to say that there's anything that we know for sure if we've ever done anything wrong, but what's sometimes easiest to open that conversation is maybe saying something along the lines of, I may not always know what to say. I may not have said the best things in the past, but I'm really trying and I'm here now. And repeating, not on repeat like a parrot, but repeating that message in some way so they hear you and they know that. That age range, I will just say, is especially difficult because that is a natural process where they start trying to separate a bit more from their parents. And then if I'm just thinking of like typical development, right? Everyone's different though, so that's a little bit different. But then the other thing too that I think of, a second piece is I've worked with kids, teenagers, young adults, and older adults too, but mostly kids, teenagers, and young adults are the main ages that I work with. And one of the things I find that's most difficult for them is to just sit and talk. And so what can be so helpful is engaging them in something that can, what I kind of call dual attention. If they're able to do that. I know like some people who may be like diagnosed with ADHD or something might have a harder time with that. But so for example, some kids I may just sit and color with them as we're talking. Even teenagers love that too. Or going on a walk while we're talking, or if they like something specific, like if they like video games, like, hey, can I sit with you while you play your video game? Getting to know what that game is, asking questions about it, starting to kind of be in their presence if they, allow for it. In terms of their own boundaries, but again, being able to have that dual attention. So just the sitting and talking face to face, that can just feel very stressful for a lot of people. So did that kind of answer your questions in a couple directions you could take?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I know,
I feel like their kids' school is actually causing a lot of stress and they have a hard time getting school administration to listen. How do you deal with sending your kid to like a Shark Tank every day and then,
Mhm.
worrying about what they're going through, and how do you then undo that stress when they get home?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's a loaded question. Yes. But such a great question and important question. Because schools do feel like such a shark tank. And that's been, I think I briefly mentioned, part of my biggest challenge and some of the things that my kiddo's been through. She's already, I will self-disclose a little bit. She's 5 and 2 gun-related incidents and a physical abuse situation in schools, right? Like unprovoked, or not unprovoked. I'm just mean not provoked by me is what I mean. And here I am, right? A therapist who works with kids with complex trauma. And I'm like, now what is going on here? It's exactly feeling like, sending your kid to a Shark Tank. Every family's a little bit different because of resources. But a few things that I think of is one, when they are coming home, because that sounded like that was part of your question, is also how to support them when they come home, is allowing them to release those emotions, because holding them in can be obviously not good for them. So in holding in mind that school setting is probably what's causing a lot of stress for them. And so even if they are, sitting and crying for 2 hours with you, they're able to release that. And stress hormones are carried throughout our body, obviously. Like when we're under stressful situations, we know we pump out a lot of cortisol, a lot of adrenaline, a lot of other types of stress hormones that aren't really good for our bodies long term. But the two best ways to actually release them, for them to actually come out of our body, is by through tears and through sweating. And so one, just helping them release those chemicals so they're not held in their body to cause more long-term effects. The other piece, I go back to that advocacy and being the advocate for your kid. Because it's tough for kids, when we say, well, Why don't you talk to the principal or why don't you talk to the teacher? There's probably I know there are wonderful teachers and principals, but there are a lot where it's go back and do your work. We're not talking about that right now, right? And so parents sometimes really have to step in and advocate for their kids. I always start with the teacher first, and then I go to the principal. I'm saying this obviously from my own experience, but also what I find to be most effective. Sounds like you've kind of already done that. And then, um, the whether it's a school board or other administration, I think those are also really good places to start advocating for um, those kinds of things. And obviously, like I said, every family's different with resources, but myself and other families I've worked with have pulled their kids from school and chosen other routes because of the things that, the school systems have um, and we're talking about the machine, the school system, right? Not always just one or two teachers. There's wonderful teachers, but absolutely can cause stress for our kiddos. And it really kind of depends on what comes out of those meetings, though, that you may have with the teacher, principal, and administration for steps to move forward.
Well, I know through conversations we've had from what you do, Cicely, you talk a lot about like strength bonding or the strength of bonds, making
Mm.
connections with other people to
Hmm.
help with the trauma and stuff. Could you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, yeah. And it kind of also goes to what I had mentioned too of being that person when your kid comes home to allow them to, release what they need. But so when kids are aging, especially like even all the way up to average brain development stops between 25, 26, 27, somewhere around there, right? Um, but a huge part of brain development for kids is actually mirroring. Has everyone heard of this?
Yes.
Yep, there's
Yeah,
nods.
yeah, yeah. And so what I always tell people is when we are talking with our kids, playing with our kids, doing different activities, even having hard conversations, we're creating those new connections in their brain and the mirroring too of how to respond to these different stressors, um, these these different experiences. And it's also allowing them to create a new story around what's happened, right? If we didn't have that before, as some of us may have not had before, but um kids will sit and make up stories in their mind. They will because they're, imaginative or and they also want to questions answered and they want to know different things. And so if we can be that person, then it helps create a new story in their mind where they're not sitting in their own thoughts of what I did wrong. Kids will blame themselves over and over and over again, not because, not typically because of any um, depression or things like that, but actually because where their brain is developmentally. Kids naturally, especially under the age of 12, are very egocentric. It's all about them, and evolution has done this just so kids can also try to get what they need, right? Like the connection and food and all the things. Um, and so when they're left kind of alone with those stories, then it's also made about them, right? But if we can have that bond and that connection, it rewrites their stories. Instead of saying it's all my fault, it's the story now when they're adults that they tell themselves is, my mom told me that this and this and this happened, and so I know it's not my fault.
Uh, Another question. So I know from what I've heard, a lot of parents here may also have some struggles with family members and talk about, and I saw a lot of people nodding earlier when you were talking about repair and
Mhm.
apologize. Any advice for parents on how to, while they're being supportive of their kid, also help family members understand the need for repair and apologize?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, families are one of the most challenging pieces for a lot of kids, especially after I've experienced trauma, but especially kiddos who identify as LGBTQ. I am curious, can I ask a follow-up real quick though, of what types of struggles are happening with families? Like is it they're, misgendering, or are they like saying completely discriminatory things? Like what's and it's probably across the board, but what are some common things?
Yeah, pretty much across the board, I think. I know some issues are misgendering. Some are, um, the love is there, but we're not gonna go all the way, kind of pretend that, we push this over here, we don't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of on the light end. I know there's more, some others here can probably speak to more severe interactions with family, but
Refusal to use chosen names or pronouns.
yeah.
Okay.
They still love their grandkid, but they're gonna still call them by the name that they were given when they were born.
Anyone else? Personal experience?
I think that pretty much covers it. I think we've all experienced, we have some conservative family members that aren't willing to accept, the way our children are and the way they are, or support them. And I think that's sort of like a personal decision as to whether or not you want to maintain that relationship. In my mind, my kids' mental health is more important than my relationship with those people. So if they want to have a relationship with us, then they have to come over to our side.
Mhm. Yeah. Yep. And that's exactly kind of where my mind was gonna go, but I wanted to hear what everyone had to say. Everyone has their own personal preference around um whether involving their family or not. So I'm not saying everybody has to do that, right? But kind of exactly to the point you were speaking, your child's mental health, physical health, well-being is of the utmost important. We also know that, looking at some of the risk factors, but um, family conflict or discrimination, things like that occur increases their risk for those long-term, outcomes, for those long-term effects. Now, the one thing I always ask though is, is the person willing or have the capacity for that repair? Because that makes a big difference too in moving forward or not. And a lot of families I worked with, it may have gotten to the point where family members just, they are not willing, they don't have the capacity. And so that was the decision the family made was, you know what, this is not in the best interest of my child to keep involving this person. Those conversations are incredibly hard and they're multifaceted, given that it's, depending on your beliefs, but a lot of people feel it's a lot harder because it's family. Um, in, for me personally, there's a lot of things that aren't quite as difficult when it comes to, my child and setting those boundaries. But I always remind parents that obviously depending on the age of the kid, but especially for our younger kids, like it definitely is our job to be able to set those boundaries and to speak up for our kids. The older our kids get though, the more we can, kind of going back to that collaboration and mutuality, we can talk to our kids about that too, of like in the like our teenagers, young adults, even younger teenagers, of say you left um I don't know, aunt and uncle's house and they were incredibly discriminatory, weren't using they were misgendering, you know, things like that. Opening up the conversation of that was not right. I also wish I would have stuck up more if you didn't, you know, I wish I would have stuck up more for you, but I really want to figure out what we can do moving forward. If it means that you don't want to go back there, that's okay. And I'll support you in that decision and I will speak up for you with that, you know. So I definitely think, you know, being able to be protective of our kids in that way is very important.
And I think something with John just said there, about coming over to our side. There are some things like that that just aren't a compromise.
Mm.
And I know the natural inclination for a lot of things is to kind of, I see your point, you know, I respect this and that, but getting across the point that this is non-negotiable, this is how things are, you're either on board or you're not, is a very important, can be difficult, but an important piece to get out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, also knowing where your child's at mental health wise, I think can speak to that as well. Because, you know, for some of the kids I work with, having family members like that to cause such distress and such shame can sometimes for our kids mean life or death. And so if you are thinking about, like if you were to say, like, you know, I hate to compare anything to any kind of like any other like medical condition, right? But like if say, you know, your kiddo went to a family member's and they didn't give them their insulin for type 1 diabetes, right? Like what would you do in that situation? That's, you know, we have to be protective of our kids no matter what, but especially in this way because the things that our kids experience, who identify as LGBTQ, and the shame that they can experience with it, the discrimination does increase their risk. So I think you're spot on with that.
Do I have anything else?
I just wanna say thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
A lot of good
Yeah.
information.
Absolutely. Are there any specific topics that anybody would like to know more about that I can gather some resources, book recommendations? I can also just send a general list as well, but I wanted to make sure I captured anything you all might want.
Are there any resources for parents to help understand trauma better? To help them be able to, I don't know, relate to the kids more? That might not be right, but just to kind of understand the impact of trauma in an
Yes.
easier to understand way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, just for starters, the NCTSN, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and then the PACES connection, that's PACES connection. Those are two sheets that I already passed out to you guys, but both of them have wonderful resources on those websites. Anywhere from research articles to book recommendations to different visuals on this exact topic. The NCTSN also gives handouts and recommendations around specific types of trauma. So you may be able to research and look at the NCTSN and say, like, filter the search and say, you know, my child has experienced bullying at school, and it'll filter all the resources on one, how to talk to your kid about that, maybe the impact of that. They do anywhere from like bullying to sexual trauma to they even do um, exposure to war, you know, like all types of traumas kids can experience, and helps you filter it between whether you're a parent or a provider looking for resources. And they have a lot of great like handouts and things like that on there. But I will email you some more recommendations because there's some really good books and podcasts too. If people aren't into websites or, you know, articles, but they like books or they like podcasts, I'll email those to you too, Adam.
Thank you. Yeah, if anybody ever like sometime after this meeting or in the future, ever have any more questions, please let me know and I'd be happy to contact Sicily. And same with if anybody is watching this recorded later on and you have any questions, definitely can let me know and I can get them to Sicily.
Can we post your sources on our website?
Absolutely. Yep.
Appreciate that.
Have no problem with that. I am not a gatekeeper of information. Everyone can, you know what I mean? Like, like people need to know these things, and people, it's important. So,
I think another great resource that I would love to have on our website is something about comorbidity is the wrong term, but when you have a child that is both on the spectrum and LGBTQ, and how you can help them deal with the inflexibility of other.
yeah, I will definitely look into that. I do work with a lot of kiddos on the spectrum and who identify as LGBTQ. It's so hard because so much of these topics are siloed, right? But they are very interconnected in people's individual lives. And so what's sometimes hard in finding research is or resources, it's like, there's resources specific to LGBTQ or specific to kiddos on the spectrum or specific to trauma, when it's like, a lot of individuals this can be about their life, all three things can be within their lives. So I will definitely look into that though and see what I can find. I do also work with our psychiatrist is pretty well known for being incredibly supportive of LGBTQ youth and kiddos on the spectrum, and she does a lot of evaluations for that. So I'll also pick her brain and see if she knows of any good resources too.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that might wrap it up then. Cicely,
All
thank you
right.
so very much today. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Let me know if you need anything else.
All right, thank you much.